Imagine this. After 4 years of tireless work, it's finally time to graduate from college and earn your degree. Imagine the feeling of finally getting to walk across a stage and receive your diploma after countless sleepless nights doing assignments, studying for tests, completing projects. Despite all of the challenges, you did it, and you're now considered a professional in your chosen field. For many of you listening, I'm sure this reality hits close to home this time of year as FIT students. However, imagine that immediately after your graduation, your family members start to swarm you with questions of marriage and settling down. Rather than asking you what job you plan to pursue, you're cornered with questions like, so, have you tried on any rings yet? And what color are you thinking for the nursery? Despite your proven educational excellence and ambition to succeed, all that your family and friends, and even your peers can see you as is a wife and a mother. But that's just the way the world is, right? This is the exact reality of the 1940s and 50s that feminist and activist Betty Friedan fought fiercely to disrupt. She believed that women were way more than just homemakers and mothers, but intellectuals who deserved the same professional freedom that men had socially inherited for centuries. As a 21-year-old, soon-to-be college graduate myself, I have never once thought about my plans to marry or have children immediately after college. Nor have I felt any pressure to sacrifice my career ambitions for anybody else. After thoroughly dissecting the 1960s feminist movement over the past several months in this course, I learned that Betty Friedan is largely to thank for that. Such realizations inspired me to dive wholeheartedly into the story of Friedan's rise to becoming a pioneer of the second wave of feminism, which I am very thrilled to tell you about today. Today, I will be informing you about the life and times of Betty Friedan. First, we will begin by discussing her early life, followed by an analysis of her rhetorical skills, as well as her legacy as a female rights activist. Betty Friedan, born Betty Goldstein, was born in 1921 in Peoria, Illinois, as the oldest of 3 children. Her father owned a jewelry store, and her mother worked as a journalist throughout her childhood. Betty's mother understood the power of language and consciously instilled that in Betty at a very young age. She highly encouraged Betty to pursue an education and become culturally well-versed. And after graduating from high school in 1938, Betty Friedan moved to Northampton, Massachusetts to major in psychology at Smith College, an all-female liberal arts university. Soon after joining the Smith College network, she became a chief of the school newspaper. Friedan specialized in pieces analyzing the United States' involvement in World War II, which was an especially sensitive topic for her specifically as a Jewish woman. At only 20 years old, at the start of World War II, she was immediately starting to have to understand what it meant to have to advocate for yourself as a result of the prejudice of others. Because of this, she really did become passionate about advocacy and free speech. And after graduating from Smith College in 1942, she went on to pursue her doctoral degree at the University of California, Berkeley, studying under the esteemed psychologist Erik Erikson. And according to the Embryo Project, Betty Friedan claimed that during this time, her boyfriend, who was a physician, was jealous of her success and offered her an ultimatum that she could either pick him or her studies. And Betty chose to prioritize his feelings and save the relationship. But the relationship did not last, and after having abandoned her studies, she moved to New York City, and similar to her mother, began working as a journalist for the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers. Oftentimes, she covered stories discussing union strikes and specifically worked closely with the women's unions. In 1947, she married Carl Friedan, with whom she later had 3 children. And after having her second child, Friedan was fired from her journalist position because the company did not find it fit for her to be working while raising children simultaneously. And while she lost her job, she started to slip into a deep depression. She utilized her psychology knowledge to kind of assess why she felt so lost. And she concluded that the abandonment of her studies and her job during motherhood contributed to a larger sense of a lack of purpose in her life. And after being fired, Friedan traveled to Smith College to celebrate her 15-year reunion with her former classmates. And with this analysis of her growing depression just consuming her headspace, Friedan took this reunion as an opportunity to see if her colleagues were feeling the same way. And according to the New York Historical Society, at this Smith College reunion in 1957, Friedan surveyed 200 women with 35 questions to gauge their overall satisfaction with their current lifestyles 15 years post-graduation. She was surprised to learn that an overwhelming majority of women graduates felt unfulfilled due to pressures to put their careers aside in the name of motherhood, a prevalent social norm of the time. Friedan was enraged to hear that so many intelligent women were so unhappy with their lives, and she decided to write an article regarding equal women's rights, which, to no surprise, the publications unanimously rejected. The poor reaction on behalf of such magazines only impassioned Friedan even further to require an advance to publish a book of her own. And in 1963, The Feminine Mystique was born. In Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, she unpacked the shame that she and her peers had shared for feeling dissatisfied by their lives as housewives and mothers as the problem with no name. In this book, she famously defines this conflict as the feminine mystique, which inspired the title. She argued that women do not only exist to serve as wives and mothers, but that they too contain the intellectual capacity to pursue a career and make decisions for themselves based on their needs. She unpacks the historical relevance of gender roles and denounces them as a myth to temporarily quell notions of post-war insecurity. The feminine mystique brings attention to the inaccessibility of contraceptives for married women in the US, leaving them vulnerable to a life of motherhood that maybe they don't truly want for themselves. And all of these topics were extremely, extremely controversial, and women were expected to stay silent. And for this reason, the feminine mystique faced both immense criticism as well as radical support from women who were feeling the same way and feeling seen by what Friedan had to say. But regardless, it definitely made waves. Many dismissed her as hysterical, angry, and male-hating, but Friedan owned her anger and utilized it as a force to be reckoned with. And 6 months after the release of The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan made the public rebuttal. Quote, "I guess a lot of women don't like my book because they feel threatened by it. Perhaps it's because they don't take themselves seriously and won't work to the limit of their ability. For them, it's easier." In light of the feminine mystique's criticism, Friedan's voice was immortalized as an icebreaker, and many consider her as the catalyst for the second wave of feminism entirely. And 3 years later, Betty Friedan attended a government-sponsored conference about women's rights in Washington, D.C., in which officials completely refused to meet the women's demand for equal employment opportunities. Later that night, Friedan, along with 20 conference attendees, met in her hotel room to discuss the demand for a women's rights-centered community group. This very moment marked the beginning of what is now known as the National Organization for Women. The NOW was created as a means to end discrimination based on sex and unify to advocate for women's rights nationwide. According to the New York Historical Society, within several months, the National Organization for Women had 300 signed members, and Betty Friedan was elected president. The NOW hosts marches, vigils, educational workshops with the purpose of bringing women together. In 1970, the National Organization for Women conducted the Women's Strike on Equality on the 50th anniversary of suffrage, which served as the largest women's rights demonstration since the suffrage movement. Women of all different walks of life joined together, as well as their male allies, to promote just a sense of togetherness and peace and equality for women across the country. And 1 year later, the Equal Rights Amendment was passed, prohibiting discrimination against women based on their sex during employment. Friedan's massive accomplishments and ability to disturb centuries' worth of gender roles in society make her a quintessential voice for women nationwide. Her passion, along with her mastery of persuasive language, allowed her to spread her message most effectively and gain immense support from women everywhere. On May 24th, 1981, Betty Friedan joined Smith College seniors in Northampton, Massachusetts, to not only celebrate their academic successes, but also relay her vital plea to women living in the United States as a generation. In considering the socio-political context of early 1980s America, it is abundantly clear why her message was so urgent. The exigence, or as Bitzer describes, imperfection marked by urgency, a thing at which is other than it should be. Behind her speech is the threat to women and minority groups presented by the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. The Reagan administration in the early 1980s reflected a resurgence of conservative ideals and popularity towards Republican politics, viciously threatening the feminist movement at the time. For example, Ronald Reagan was a key opponent to the Equal Rights Amendment of 1970, which prohibited gender discrimination under the United States law. During his presidency, Reagan was a vocal adversary of the 1973 court rulings of Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion across the United States. Altogether, his staunch efforts to strip women of their rights were inherently a heavy reflection of general American attitudes towards women at the time, further motivating influential voices like Friedan to incite a major change. For Friedan, Smith College, an all-women's institution in 1981, was the perfect means to reach a powerful audience of driven women that would bring her message to life. And in acknowledgement of the deep-rooted societal restraints of the time, Friedan skillfully utilizes ethos, pathos, and logos to destruct harmful, prevalent gender roles and call her listeners to action in the fight towards female equality. In the beginning portion of her speech, Betty Friedan utilizes a strong sense of ethos as an intellectual, an activist, and part of the Smith College community herself. According to a professional linguistical analysis pioneered by Saskatchewan University, ethos, a rhetorical device used to relay a sense of credibility and authority, is necessary to build trust when giving a speech. Friedan does this by describing her personal experience to the audience.
The seeds of it were probably planted here nearly 40 years ago. In my 15th reunion in 1957, appalled at what I later came to call the feminine mystique that was working against the very seriousness and truth of education that the women were receiving here. What ended for me in the women's movement began.
Betty Friedan, like those listening to her speak at the commencement ceremony, was once a student at Smith College herself. Her mention of this fact is significant in ensuring that the women in the audience realize that she too was in their position years ago and has witnessed firsthand the threat that targets women as they graduate college and start raising families. She also references the feminine mystique, which is a nod to the revolutionary phrase that she coined herself. Here, she pays homage to a notable point in her career in the feminist movement, one that inarguably incited the second wave of feminism. In collaboration with ethos as a persuasive rhetorical device, Betty Friedan also applies pathos through passionately charged emotional word choice within her speech. According to the major consulting firm Upward Spiral Group, pathos, when used correctly, is one of the most powerful ways to build a human connection between the message sender and the message receiver. Friedan, in this case, exercises pathos when she describes the dullness within society's idealistic image of womanhood. She says, "I am not saying that we can or would ever dream of returning to the family of the feminine mystique, choosing the sort of role of the passive, dependent housewife, which was a denigration and an insult to the intelligent women." Here, Friedan includes negative adjectives, painting a picture of a woman nobody would ever dream to be. This exposes the grim reality of the optionless American housewife. Further in the speech, Friedan refers to men as male chauvinist pigs to incite a feeling of productive anger towards the patriarch. However, she does not reflect solely feelings of anger and powerlessness. Towards the end of her speech, Friedan leaves the audience with an emotional beacon of hope for all Americans when she claims, "But women and men must come to a new, passionate, humanist political activism of passionate volunteerism that can transcend and restore this country to services of life which are our concern, your concern. You have the strength to do this." After inciting feelings of productive outrage, Friedan proves that her listeners can take action to save themselves from the threat of their social and political circumstances. Through her language, she leaves her listeners in a motivational, inspired state rather than the alternative of hopelessness and defeat. Along with her usage of ethos and pathos, Betty Friedan utilizes logos to describe the historical process of women's fight for freedom in the United States. Logos is a rhetorical appeal to the audience's sense of logic and reason, providing a perspective that is entirely inarguable. Friedan describes the American feminist movement as, quote, the pendulum swing from feminism to feminine mystique, back and forth, which in effect brought the first century-long struggle for women's rights to a halt after the vote was won in 1920 because those first feminists, the suffragettes, our foremothers, did not confront the realities of the family. By including reference of pivotal points in American women's history, Betty Friedan proves her knowledge that the fight for gender equality has been in process for over a century. By mentioning the history of the women's rights movement, she proves that feminists have been present in American history for generations and will never, ever be taken out of the fabric of the greater United States population. Additionally, Betty Friedan also utilizes anaphora to emphasize the major themes in her speech. Anaphora refers to the repeating of the same phrase at the beginning of multiple sentences. For example, Friedan introduces several concepts with the phrase, I am not saying, to avoid any form of misinterpretation. She knowingly makes this distinction because she knows how anti-feminists will manipulate her language to mislead Americans further into harm's way. By repeating this phrase, she proves that she is well-spoken, she's intentional, and will not be misunderstood. Additionally, Friedan has a very impressive verbal delivery in her commencement speech. She has this commanding tone throughout the entirety of the speech, but she speaks at a very slow, steady pace. Her cadence quickens in moments of passion and slows when she relays any sort of dramatic, harsh realities. Her inflection remains engaging and authentic. But rather than being preachy or pretentious, she speaks conversationally to her listeners. She's not monotone, but rather impassioned as her voice increases and decreases in pitch naturally. While there are only audio recordings of this specific commencement speech at Smith College, we can infer from other visual recordings of Betty Friedan, like this one here, that she has a tendency to be very gestural. She exudes confidence by keeping her body fluid with the intentional movement. Her rhetorical skills in tandem with her verbal and nonverbal delivery make this speech especially effective and iconic from the perspective of a historical observer of the women's rights movement. Such strategies allowed Betty Friedan to inspire her audience, graduating women, to take full advantage of their education, rather than wasting it away under the heavy weight of the societal pressures of the 1980s. As for her legacy, by the year of Betty Friedan's death in 2006, over 3 million copies were sold of The Feminine Mystique, and the number only continues to grow. In a current political climate where it is impossible to turn the other cheek on female rights, young people everywhere continue to learn the sentiments of Betty Friedan. Even in the year 2025, the National Organization for Women is still in operation, assisting females nationwide in accessing contraceptives, conducting protests, and offering resources. It is dire that we continue to educate young generations on the impact of activists like Betty Friedan, for it shows them that they too can make a difference through passion and skill and perseverance. And as graduation season is approaching, we must remember that women who came before us, who fought for a level playing field in the workforce and women's rights as a whole. We must remember Betty Friedan and the National Organization for Women and the fearlessness of activists from the women's rights movement for making our futures possible. The problem that, thanks to Betty Friedan, does have a name is not going to define us in 2025. It is up to us, after graduation, to have jurisdiction over our futures and live a life that serves us. The best way we can do that is by being vocal and utilizing the strength in language and rhetorical strategy, just like forebears who paved the way. Thank you all so much for listening.